In the year 2200 BC, the sky stopped working for 160 years. Across 3 continents, 15 million people had nowhere to go. This wasn't a bad harvest. This wasn't a dry decade. Both the summer monsoons failed. The winter rains failed. Just imagine California drought. Now imagine it lasting for years you were born until your grandchildren die of old age. That's what happened in 2200 BC. And when it did, 3 of history's greatest civilizations ended in the same century. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire, the world's first empire, collapsed. Cities like Tel Lilian stood empty for 300 years. Rainfall dropped 30%. A Sumerian poem called it the curse of Akkad, described fields turning into dust, people eating their own children. In Egypt, the Nile failed. For the first time in 1,000 years, the floods didn't come. The old kingdom shattered into warlord states. An Egyptian governor named Akhenaten carved into his tomb. All of the Upper Egypt was dying of hunger, and people were not getting anything to eat. And on the other side of the world, in Indus Valley, 71% of cities went silent. Not burned, not invaded, just empty. But here's what nobody talks about. 2 of these civilizations left us bureaucratic records, lists of reduced grains rations, administrative complaints about water shortages, government documents. But only one civilization left us something else. A testimony of what it felt like to live through the end of the world. Book 8 through 20th of the Atharvaveda. And when you place these ancient Sanskrit hymns next to archaeology, well, they match. Year by year, crisis by crisis. This is the story of a drought that wrote itself into scriptures. Let's start with what science tells us, because this isn't a theory. This is measurable. The scientists call it 4.2 kiloyear event. They can see it in cave stalagmites in northern India, in sediment cores pulled from the Arabian Sea, in dust layers in the Gulf of Oman. The India's summer monsoon, which brings 80% of the subcontinent's annual rainfall, weakened by 10 to 20%. But here's the detail that killed civilizations. The winter monsoon failed too. Both crop cycles gone. And you can see exactly when this started emptying cities. The Indus Valley civilization stretched across what is now Pakistan and northwest India. Over 1,400 settlements at its peak. In one region, Cholistan, the downstream end of Saraswati River system, archaeologists surveyed 414 sites, out of which 174 were major cities during the mature Harappan period. Every site thriving between 2600 to 1900 BC. But by 1800 BC, only 50 were still occupied. That's 71% gone in 1 century. And the collapse moved in one direction. Downstream first, Ganveriwala, 66 hectares, one of the 5 largest Indus cities, abandoned by 1900 BC. No late phase, just gone. Kalibangan, midstream, completely deserted by 1750 BC. The excavation reports explicitly state we may not look to foreign invasions to explain its end. But upstream, Rakhigarhi, Banavli, they survived until 1400 BC. Why? Because when a river is dying, the water never reaches the mouth first. It stops at the source. The people downstream watched their river disappear, while people upstream could still dig wells and hit groundwater at 35 to 40 meters. And this isn't a mystery. This is hydrology with established evidence. And then the soil. It tells us exactly how they tried to adapt. At Harappa, wheat and barley dominated the diet during the Prosperous period. Millets were only 4% of the crop. By the collapse period, millets jumped to 12.5%. At sites in Gujarat, like Babarkot, millets reached 95% of all crops. At Kirsara, the shift is even more brutal. Early phase 90% barley, a perfect monoculture thriving on winter rains. Late phase pearl millets, sorghum, rice. Drought-resistant summer crops that survive when winter rain stops. This wasn't a cultural preference. This was desperation in agriculture. The winter wheat crop failed. The Rabi harvest that had fed the civilization for thousands of years just stopped working. But archaeologists, they found something else in the faunal remains. A study from Bhirana notes a general decrease in exploitation of fishes, which shows that not many prominent water bodies were present towards the end. The lakes were vanishing, the rivers were drying. But the population, it didn't disappear. It moved east towards the Gangetic Plains, away from the drying river. And here's what haunts me about this. They didn't flee in panic. There are no last days of the Pompeii scene. No bodies in doorways, no sealed granaries with food still inside. The archaeology shows gradual decline. Normal burial continues, wells being dug with expert precision. Life is slowly draining away, which means generations of people were born, lived, and died watching their world end, knowing there was nothing they could do to stop it. But one group of people decided to write it down. Well, let me show you something. The Vedas, these ancient Sanskrit texts, aren't one book dropped from the sky. They are a progression, a timeline, different books written at different times describing different worlds. The Rig Veda is early. It describes a world of abandoned rivers, especially one river that appears 72 times, Saraswati, best mother, best river, best goddess, a mighty river. But by the time you reach Atharvaveda, the fourth and latest Veda, something has changed. This river has a new name. Vinashna, the disappearing one. Not a mother of floods anymore, not mighty, just disappearing. And here's the fact that makes this matter. The Saraswati River was already monsoon dependent by the Harappan built their cities. Its major tributaries, the Satluj and the Yamuna, had been captured by other rivers thousands of years earlier. OSL dating and uranium-led synchron analysis confirms this, so this data is not disputed. Which meant when the monsoons failed in 2200 BCE, the river had no backup, no glacial melt water to sustain. And it went seasonal, then ephemeral, then memory. The Atharvaveda has 20 books. The first 7 books, similar to the Rig Veda, ritual hymns, prayers, sacrifices, the world is still normal but is still household. But 8th through 20th, everything changes. The anxiety changes. The language becomes obsessed with protection, fear, and survival. And when scholars attempt to date these books using linguistic layers, internal references, and comparative chronology, they consistently place them inside the same century when the archaeology shows collapse. But the dates, well, they are disputed. And currently, the timeline that we are looking at is 1900 to 1500 BC, because this is the exact window when 71% of the cities were abandoned, when crops failed, when the rivers disappeared. So what if book 8 through 20, they are not mythology and they are testimony? And let me show you how. Book 8 through 11, well, they are obsessed with one thing: protection from downward collapse, protection from the earth getting swallowed, chants for stability, for grounding, for safety, over and over again. And if you read this as a generic spiritual anxiety, it sounds like a normal text. But if you read this as a climate testimony, it sounds like people watching cracks appear in the ground and not knowing what's coming next. And this matches 2200 to 2000 BC, the early phases of the mega drought, when monsoon first starts falling, when the first downstream cities are abandoned, when people realize something is wrong, but they don't know yet, and they don't know if it would ever stop. And then book 12. Book 12 has a hymn that should have made headlines decades ago. A prayer begging the earth not to crack open. It says, "May the earth not split beneath us." And in 1900 BC, the period when Book 12 was likely composed, 71% of Cholistan's cities were abandoned. Why? Because when a monsoon-fed river stops flowing, the water table drops, the ground destabilizes, clay soil shrink, which cracks, subsidence, collapse all become real and visible fear. And someone living with that fear must have written down this prayer: please earth, don't crack. And this isn't abstract theology. This is the environmental trauma that Atharvaveda is preserving. By book 13 through 17, the focus shifts, and now it's water, it's protection from drought, fear of other rivers failing, prayers for rain that never came. The Saraswati is barely mentioned anymore. And when it is not, it's not even celebrated. And this matches the timeline of 1900 BC to 1700 BC. The river has gone ephemeral, seasonal, only flowing during the monsoon. But if the monsoon never comes, then the river never flows. And we know this from sediment cores that monsoon were failing repeatedly. Droughts lasting 25 to 90 years. There is one drought which is mentioned that lasted for 160 years. Imagine being a farmer in this world. Your grandfather remembered when the river flowed year round. Your father remembered when it flowed most of the year. And now you, in your lifetime, it never flows. And maybe a month. That's the world described in book 13 to 15, a world running out of water, which matches the hydrological and the Paleochannel data. Then there is book 19. Book 19 is saturated with famine. Hymn after hymn, crop failure, soil exhaustion, fear of starvation. I counted at least 23 that directly address hunger and scarcity in this world. The density is striking and the repetition is obsessive. At Harappa, wheat and barley collapsed. Millet went from 4% to 12.5%. At Babarkot, millet became 95% of the crop. At Khirsara, the entire agriculture system flipped. Barley, monoculture, gone, replaced by pearl millets, sorghum, and rice. Why? Because winter wheat needs winter rains, and the winter rain stopped coming. The Ravi harvest that sustained the civilization for 1,000 years failed, and someone documented the terror of watching the field die in hymn after hymn after hymn. When a civilization this large collapses, people don't flee in one direction. They scatter, and that's exactly what happened. Some people went to Swat. Some they found late Harappan pottery style and mixed with new burial practices. Some went northwest towards BMAC, the Bacteria Margiana archaeological complex in Central Asia. Harappan seals and artifacts appear there around 1900 BC. Some went south to Gujarat. Site numbers there actually increased during the collapse. And some went east towards the Gangetic plains and the upper Saraswati tributaries, where groundwater was still accessible. Different groups, different destination, different survival strategies. The people who went to Swat left us graves and pottery. The people who went to BMAC left us seals and trading goods. The people who went to Gujarat left us settlement patterns. But the people who went east, they maintained something else. They continued the oral tradition. They continued the textual memory, the Atharvaveda. And here's what makes this critical. Through book 8 till 9, it describes a world without kings. No royal genealogies, no great battle between kingdoms, no centralized authority, just survival hymns, protection chants, agricultural anxiety, environmental terror. A leaderless people trying to outlast catastrophe. And that matches exactly what the archaeology shows us. The collapse of Harappan centralized authority, standardized seals disappear, uniform weights vanish, the script stopped being used, long distance trade networks breaking down. The infrastructure of kingship collapses. And then book 20th, it changes everything. Book 20th celebrates the establishment of King Parikshit. Not just any king, a legitimate ruler whose authority is recognized, whose kingship is ritualized, whose reign marks a new beginning. After 12 books of silence about political leadership, kingship finally returns. And with it, the terror hymns stop. And here's what we can measure. Book 20 dates to approximately 1450 to 1300 BC. And that's the painted graveware culture, which emerges in the upstream Saraswati region in the same window. Both represent political reorganization after the collapse. You can call it a coincidence if you want, but the timeline, it doesn't care about what you call it. These settlements would eventually become the Mohenjo-daros, the 16 great kingdoms of ancient India. The people who preserved the Atharvaveda, they weren't just remembering the collapse. They were recording their survival and their birth. So let's be clear about what we have just shown. The 4.2 kiloyear mega drought is scientifically documented and is undisputed. The Indus Valley civilization collapse during this drought is also now undisputed. The Atharvaveda book 8 through 20 describes the same environmental catastrophe: cracking earth, disappearing rivers, crop failure, famine, the absence of political order, and then a restoration in the same exact period. The archaeological evidence and the textual evidence align perfectly, year by year, crisis by crisis. Egypt left us administrative records about the reduced rations. Mesopotamia left us poetry about angry gods. But the Indus Valley left us something that no other Bronze Age civilization did: a testimony what it felt like to watch your world end and to survive it. For 150 years, the story we were taught was this: Indus Valley civilization was pre-Vedic. Then around 1500 BC, Aryan invaders from the steppe arrived with horses and chariots and the Vedas. They created a new culture on the top of ruins. That story requires the Veda to be written after the Indus Valley collapse. But we have just shown that Atharvaveda was written during the collapse by people living through it. So here's the question that demands an answer. If the Vedic people were writing about the Harappan collapse while it was happening, what does that make them? This isn't a conquest. This is a continuity. And this forces us to reconsider one thing. For decades, Western scholars dismissed the Saraswati River as mythology. It never existed. It's a metaphor. We now have satellite imagery showing a paleo channel exactly where the Vedas describe it. Excavation finding Harappan sites along the paleo channel. OSL datings proving the river flowed until 1900 to 1500 BC. Sediment cores showing when and why it dried up. And now textual evidence showing the Vedic people watched it disappear and wrote about it the real time. The Saraswati was real, and there is no dispute. It died, and its death was so traumatic that it became encoded in scriptures. And here's what haunts me most about this story. We talk about the Indus Valley civilization as if it mysteriously disappears, as if 5 million people just vanished. They didn't disappear. They survived. They washed their cities empty. They switched crops when wheat failed. They dug deeper wells when the river stopped flowing. They migrated east when the west became uninhabitable. They went all around the world that they knew. They adapted their burial practices when they couldn't maintain necropolises anymore. And they wrote down their terror and their hope. Their descendants became the Vedic kingdoms, the Mohenjo-daros, the Mauryans, the Guptas. Their descendants are us. But this story didn't end with a drought. The story is that they survived the drought and they made sure we will remember it. Not through monuments, not through palaces, through words, passed down generation after generation for the last 10,000 years. Until we could finally decode the Indus Valley script. But there is one question that still remains. If the Atharvaveda decoded the collapse, what did the Rig Veda record? Because the Rig Veda is earlier. It describes a world before crisis, a world of 7 rivers, abundant harvest, great battles, powerful kingdoms. And when you match the Rig Veda's geography to archaeology, the entire story of India's origin changes. And this investigation has 3 more parts. All the 3 parts, they are collaborated into one playlist so that you can watch them in chronology. So watch them because you need to see a complete picture. Theories can survive in books for 100 years, but the soil, it doesn't lie. And when the archaeologists finally listen to what the ground is saying, every old assumption collapses. If you made it this far, you are not just watching history anymore. You are part of rediscovering it. And subscribe if you want to see where this investigation goes further. Until then, this is Harry signing off. Stay curious.